Hello, Rutgers Online Learning Conference folks. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk with you about essential skills. I'm Beth Ardner. I'm a product manager from Weave, and I've been working with the Rutgers University libraries for some time around skills. So I'm excited to talk about this subject, excited to share with you about how this applies to the online learning space. But also want to begin with a caveat to let you know that much of what we'll discuss today can also be applied to the work that you are maybe doing in an in-person classroom as well. So I introduced myself, but if you are unfamiliar with Weave, I want to make sure you know who we are. So we're an accreditation software solutions provider. At Weave, we think about a lot of different components of that process. And we want to look at it not just as the necessary delivery of information to accreditors, but also as supporting the assessment process down to the student skill development and validation. So you'll see that we're thinking about this from end to end. If you are a Rutgers University faculty member, you may have already heard about the work we are doing with the RU libraries. You may have also heard it under a different name. Previously, those resources were coming from Nimblywise. They are now under the Weave banner, and we're really excited to be there. So if you are seeing Nimblywise anywhere in your material, know that that is Weave, and that's what we're talking about today. I like to start every presentation thinking about a couple different things and really getting our mental muscles ready to dig into some meaty thoughts about essential skills. To do that, I want to ask you to consider the questions on the screen. Take a moment and read through each one. I'll read them as well. And maybe jot down a few notes. Keep them beside you for the presentation so you have time to think about how you might apply these things after you leave this space. So here we go. First, how do you define essential skills? The term itself is a little bit vague, and everyone has a slightly different definition. I want to make sure you are starting this time from that perspective of what you understand essential skills to be. Once you have that in your head, take a moment and think about what the biggest challenge is to embedding essential skills in your course and the biggest opportunity for you. I particularly would encourage you to write these two down because they're great places to start after the fact in applying some of the components we're going to talk about. I also would love you to consider how confident you feel that you're currently teaching and assessing essential skills. Is this something that you are coming to as an expert, or is this a new component for you that you're starting to work on? Everyone is at a different place in that process. Would love for you to think about where you sit and see if you still feel that that's the spot you're in when at the end. You may leave this feeling like you knew more than you realized, or you may realize there's definitely more room for growth than you thought. And then lastly, as we dive into the material, what is one thing you hope to learn more about in this session? I'm going to give you a minute to go ahead and jot some things down, and then we'll jump in. Okay. If you're still writing, don't worry, there'll be plenty of time. I encourage you to go ahead and finish those thoughts up as I get started, and would love for you to take notes throughout. There will also be materials available. I'm available at the Weave booth to chat, and I'll make sure you have my email address at the end if there's anything you'd like to talk about in more detail. So let's start with a definition of essential skills. Many folks, when they're thinking about essential skills, jump immediately to AAC&U's essential learning outcomes, and for good reason. They're a great place to start thinking about this. AAC&U defines those as the knowledge and skills gained from a liberal education that provide a framework to guide students' cumulative progress. That's a helpful thought process, but it doesn't get us down to the meat of what an actual usable skill is. You have to dig a little further. Now, AAC&U does provide materials to start to think about those skills, but I am partial to the skills that NACE provides. So I'm going to be talking largely from that viewpoint today. NACE refers to essential skills under the same banner as career readiness and defines them as requisite core competencies that broadly prepare the college educated for success in the workplace and lifelong career management. So there's two different things that I really think are important to point out when we think about AAC&U. We're talking about guiding success in and progress in the classroom. When NACE thinks about it, they're also thinking about success outside of the classroom. Both of those are important components to consider when we're talking about essential skills. If you're still kind of scratching your head and going, okay, career readiness, essential skills, core competencies, what are we talking about? There are a few other terms that you may have heard thrown around. 21st century skills, power skills, soft skills, durable skills. I am partial to durable skills, although you won't hear me use that throughout. The reason that one particularly piques my interest is because it focuses on the idea that the skill is not just for use in the moment, but that is applicable for a long time after it was learned. For the purpose of essential skills today, we may talk about these particular skills. This is the career readiness competencies as provided by NACE's most recent delivery of that framework. If you're not familiar with it, I certainly would encourage you to go take a look. In addition to providing definitions for each of these areas, NACE provides sample behaviors that allow us to get a deeper understanding of each competency and to see examples of what these competencies and skills look like in practice. So we now have at least a generalized understanding of what essential skills are, but why do they particularly matter, say, above any of the other things, the very important things that are also going on in the classroom? The reason essential skills are really vital has a lot to do with how a student is going to take that information and use it. And a lot of that information is going to go directly into their career. There's been numerous studies done, both formal and informal, on how managers feel employees are doing. We can say that only half of managers feel employees that have recently graduated are prepared. 60% of managers feel that critical thinking and problem-solving skills are the soft skill that are most lacking. NACE reports also that those skills are still the #1 skill set required. When we think about those things in the context of online learning, there's an added dimension. Many online learners are not learning and then going into the workplace for the first time. They're typically working simultaneously with having an online learning experience. When that's the case, it isn't 4 years later that a student takes the skills that they are learning and applies them. It is actually the very next day after they leave the classroom. We also know that students struggle with these skills. Problem-solving, communications, and critical thinking in particular are a struggle throughout a student's educational experience. Colleges also still put an emphasis more on content than on skills. I say more because many more institutions are beginning to look at skills and consider where they fit and how to make better better use of them and better focus of them in the discipline. And the content in your discipline is vitally important. If I'm an engineer, an engineering student, I want to know how to be an engineer. And if I am a nursing student, I want to know how to be a nurse. But the reality of the matter is that both engineers and nurses and any other student need those underpinning skills, problem solving, communication, teamwork, so many others, to successfully apply the knowledge that they are gaining about your discipline. We also know that employers are more and more saying that a diploma is no longer enough to secure a good job. Simultaneous to that, we see other elements where a college degree is starting to be removed as a requirement. Federal government, for example, does not require it to get a job. When you look at those two seemingly opposite elements, you can see the tension in what is the appropriate level of preparedness and what is necessary for good work. Above it all, though, we still see over and over again, these skills, regardless of education level, are vital. And lastly, we know that skills are a process learned by repetition and exposure. And that brings us to a couple more key elements. So repetition and exposure, I'm just going to quickly share these. I know I'm preaching to the choir. In one survey, we know that 93% of employers agreed that candidates for a job needed to demonstrate their capacity for thinking critically, communicating clearly, and solving complex problems. And not only that, but that it was more important than what they majored in. Job placement has consistently been in the top 2 factors in enrollment decisions. It popped up to 1 at one point. The other in the top 2 is always going to be cost. So how much is it going to cost me, and will this get me a job? And a student's experience, how they manage, how they succeed in the classroom, drives 73% of their decision to persist. There are fewer jobs now than there were before. 14% of jobs were lost in the last 2 recessions. And accreditors are more and more demanding evidence, not just of knowledge, or not just of the content that's being taught, but of knowledge and skill acquisition. Meanwhile, funding is decreasing from a number of angles, and faculty are expected to do more with less. If there is anything you take away from the session today, this is the thing I hope you remember. There are 3 key things to remember when thinking about skills that make them unique from knowledge acquisition. One is that skills need to be made explicit. Another is that skills develop over time. And lastly, skills are learned by doing. I'm going to repeat that again. Skills need to be made explicit. They develop over time, and they are learned by doing. So those things represent problems and opportunities. If skills need to be explicit, then we need to consider what that means. And more often than not, skills are not defined, taught, or assessed explicitly within the classroom. I love this quote from Scott Ryan at Claflin University. He's someone I had the absolute pleasure of working with. And in those conversations, he was doing work around understanding the explicit promises that institutions make on their websites and on their promotional materials when they are recruiting. He says many institutions of higher learning include as part of their mission statements the goal of developing people who are globally engaged, effective leaders, and productive and informed members of society. Yet often the forms, the specific assignments, and the skills necessary to achieve these goals remain unstated and are left to individual professors to determine. What that means in a nutshell is there are great explicit goals, and there's a disconnect between those goals and the actual explicit instruction and development of skills. And we're not saying that we're going to be recreating the wheel. We've talked about AAC&U and NACE. Both of these organizations are great. They have great materials. We're going to come back and see this again. But more importantly, you don't need to start from scratch. You can go to these spaces. I encourage you to engage with NACE. I encourage you to engage with the AACNU, utilize the resources available to them, take a look at those, and consider how those pieces may support the work that you are doing. But let's talk about what that work is. So when we talk about making a skill explicit, the backwards design process is your best friend. So what is it? So stage one, identify the desired results. What content is worthy of understanding? What enduring understandings are desired? What is it we want the student to be able to do when we leave? From a skills perspective, it's as simple as I want a student to be able to effectively evaluate bias in a source. That's a skill. So we want those desired outcomes. That's the learning outcome itself. From there, we need to determine acceptable evidence. How do we know if a student has done that? How do we know if that learning has been achieved, and what proof do we need of that achievement? That's the assessment and assignment design period. And then lastly, we need to make sure that we're putting learning activities that support instruction. So what are the most appropriate instructional activities? What are the teaching methods, the sequence of lessons, the materials to convey learning? This might feel familiar from the perspective of your discipline, but I challenge you to think of it from the perspective of essential skills. We are not simply wanting to have learners who come out with a clear knowledge of their discipline, but also with the skills to apply it. There are a lot of tools at your disposal to support this process. Your syllabus, grading rubrics, your assignments themselves. When you think about shifting the way you introduce a student to the why of your course and your assignments, that places skills front and center for your students. For example, in your syllabus, do you tell students what foundational or essential skills that they will be learning in the course? Do you know which skills they'll be learning? What about the skills that they will need to be successful? When you are looking at that same syllabus, do you define those skills for the students, or do you just give them the terminology? For example, if you know that your course is going to engage with critical thinking, have you explained to your students what critical thinking is? Have you helped them grasp that concept? Further to that, when you are grading a learner, you can make this explicit by showing them how these skills are being graded. Taking those assignments a step further and saying, in addition to addressing the assignment that I assigned you, I can see critical thinking skills, or I can see communication skills, or I can insert the essential skill here in this way. If you're not comfortable with sorting out the rubric for those skills yourselves, the AAC and U value rubrics are freely available, and I would strongly recommend looking at them as a starting point. Your campus may also have institutional rubrics for institutional outcomes that you can adopt into your grading processes. And then lastly, your assignments themselves are a vital tool for making these things explicit. You can take the assignment, and instead of saying, hey, I'm going to teach you today about this disciplinary topic for our subject matter, you can say, I'm going to take this topic and I'm going to apply, you're going to learn how to apply it using this skill. Shifting away from just knowledge acquisition to the why does it matter is huge. An anecdote for you on this. I worked with a professor who, absolutely stunningly fabulous woman in the criminal justice field. We were talking about her 400 level course, and considering why students seem to struggle with a particular portion of the final. The final was a research paper with an annotated bibliography. In this particular case, the annotated bibliography that students should have known how to do by that point in their college careers is where they were struggling repeatedly. When I asked why that was there, when we started to take that apart, it became evident that the annotated bibliography was actually the most important part of the assignment. It held a significant number of points, and that was because the students going through this course and leaving this 400 level class were going to need to be able to properly cite and annotate things that happened from a legal perspective to support the work they would be doing in criminal justice. without that, court cases could be thrown out, and any various number of things could go wrong in the process of applying these skills to their work. We sat back and said, okay, well, that's probably what needs to be addressed. And a few months later, I spoke with her again, and she said to me, you won't believe what I did. And I asked her what? She said she threw out her final, which initially made me go, oh, goodness. But what she explained then was that she, instead of requiring an in-depth research paper that focused on skills that were already learned somewhere else and already demonstrated somewhere else, she focused on that bibliography, but she spent time explaining to students why the bibliography mattered and what skills they were demonstrating and how those skills would be valuable to them in the future. Once she had put that perspective on the assignment, the students did significantly better because they understood the importance of it and how the skills that were being used would be valuable to them. Adding that context to make skills explicit changes the perspective of what your students are doing. So problem number 2, it takes time to develop a skill. There's the infamous, it takes 10,000 hours to be an expert in anything. That is true of skills. It takes time to develop skills. You don't simply get on a bike and know how to ride it. You don't simply pick up a foreign language dictionary and know how to speak it eloquently and well. In all of these cases, we're talking about a skill, and skills need to be used, and that means it's going to take time. You're going to start from one point and move on to the others. In curriculum, that means we're talking about scaffolding. And not just scaffolding how a learner goes through their discipline, but where do the skills get introduced? Where do the skills get reinforced? At what point do we expect students to have mastery of those skills, and where are we assessing them? Understanding that when we talk about multiple skills allows us to start to see a web throughout our curriculum. 100 and 200 level courses, the focus shouldn't be on every single skill. Students are not going to be able to take and use multiple skills in that very complex way until they have been introduced to those skills and they have been explicitly taught. Many of you, I mentioned the Rutgers University libraries. Many of you may be familiar with some of the Weave resources that are available to you through the RU libraries. Thinking about incorporating those skills into your courses, particularly at the 100 and 200 level, where you can take a ready-made piece of content and embed it into your course as homework for students to engage with, is a great way to start introducing that explicit teaching. It's not meant to replace anything you're doing, but it's a great support. And I would encourage you to reach out to your RU libraries, your liaisons, to think about how that might help you get these materials more explicitly into your courses. The further up we go, the more skills come into play. Now, one of the tricky things about online learning is that oftentimes we are learning at a different pace. There are still in many online learning environments scenarios that are much more along the traditional 16-week line, but in many online learning environments, students are able to take classes more rapidly. They are taking them asynchronously at different paces. And so when we think about this scaffolding, understanding that students are not necessarily going to go from point A to point B to point C, that they may go from point A to point C, back to point B, and then on to D, is a part of that process. The key here is making sure that they are explicit at the outset, but then also that there are numerous places for the skills to be incorporated and practiced. And then lastly, skills are developed through hands-on practice. I can tell you what critical thinking is, and you could learn that concept and repeat it back to me. You could repeat that concept over and over, but if you don't use it, it's still not going to be well developed. Let's think about this from a sense of how a skill is developed. So looking at Bloom's taxonomy here on the left-hand side, you'll see all the different types of learning. So as we remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. When we think about how knowledge is acquired, understanding and remembering are the key areas that is done. But when we think about skills and abilities, for them to be acquired, they require higher levels on Bloom's, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. This is an important thing to keep in mind when we talk about giving opportunities to practice skills. It isn't simply a matter of repeating the skill back. It's a matter of using it in context. When I say in context, we're talking about a couple different things. So to engage with the world in this way, so in the way of using these essential skills, an individual must be capable of performing meaningful tasks that they will use in the real world. Think back to that criminal justice professor who was taking that context and saying, oh, actually, this is why this is a meaningful task that you will need to know for the real world. Keeping that in mind, the assignments need to help students become proficient at performing those tasks that they'll encounter when they graduate, or in the case of online learning, sometimes that they'll encounter tomorrow at work. And then lastly, to determine if it's successful, the school must then ask students to perform those tasks that replicate real world challenges in order to confirm if they are successful. So we think about the learning pyramid and the ways that learning is acquired. Again, this is a similar concept. We see that these active learning components, demonstration, discussion, practice, teaching, each of these components is more effective at teaching skills and retention of those skills. When we think about our assignment design, meaningful tasks in the real world, what is this thing and how can I practice it? If teamwork is something I'm going to need to be saying I can do here, what does it mean to set up a team and confirm that not just the task was done, but that the team was effective in a learning experience? There's a lot of information here, and in any one of these areas, it would be very easy to spend a lot of time digging deeper. I'd love to talk with any of you about that and think about your classes with you. Think about how Weave can support you, either if you're a Rutgers team member, by partnering with the Rutgers University libraries to utilize the Weave resources, or if you're not a Rutgers team member and you're curious to know more, talking together about how these things apply in a one-on-one scenario. But I want to leave you with some food for thought, some things to consider. Again, taking that paper and pencil, looking at those things we started with, our stretching our mental muscles, and wrapping up with these areas. Of the 3 challenges that I described, which of those feels the most daunting to you, and which feels the most comfortable? Again, those 3 challenges are the challenge that skills must be taught explicitly, the skills are developed over time, and that skills are learned by doing. From there, which concepts from the presentation were new for you? Were there any elements here that was the first time you'd heard it, or maybe it was the first time that it clicked in a certain way for you? And which things were familiar? You thought, yeah, I've got that, I'm doing that. Have you applied any of these concepts to assignments in your courses before in order to evaluate essential skills? Think about how that went if you have. Make sure to take the time to step back and reflect on that experience. And then lastly, as you're leaving my session, I want to encourage you to think of one thing based on the session that you might like to try or change or tweak or consider in your classes. What's something you can take and do to make a small change tomorrow that would impact your students in these areas? I'm going to give you again another minute to write some things down, and then we'll wrap up. Okay. So a reminder that at their core, skills are what makes it possible for learners to do well in the classroom. They're what makes it possible for students to do well outside of the classroom, in their work and in their daily lives. If our goal as educators is to get out there and really impact students and create change for them, help them have those better lives, this is a great place to start. If you are an RU team member, there's some links here for you to consider. You can find these on the RU Library's webpage as well. Visit their use library resources page, that teaching support area. That includes the Weave resources that are available to you. You'll note that they're currently called Nimbly Wise on the site, but those are the Weave resources. Really want to encourage you to take a look. They're very easy to embed into your Canvas course shells with a simple LTI link. If that's something that you're interested in, the RU Library's liaison librarians are there to help, or I'm certainly happy to help as well. And then also, if you want to speak with a librarian, the link to reach out to them is here. You may already know who your librarians are, but if you're not sure, this is a great way to get started. And finally, thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation, to consider the topics that we have gone over today, and to think about how skills can be made more explicit in your courses. We have a booth here on the Hopin app, so please come on in and say hello, or feel free to email me to chat about how Weave can support you. My email is beth@weaveeducation.com. Thank you again for coming.